Welcome, everybody. Good evening. I am Nancy Worley, Interim General Manager at KPBS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 15th annual One Book, One San Diego launch event. Before we start, some housekeeping items. For YouTube viewers, if you require closed captioning, please click on the small CC box in the bottom right corner of your screen. For Facebook viewers, if you require closed screen and slide the button to captions on. I'm a reader myself, and every year I look forward to learning what book the One Book, One San Diego Advisory Committee has selected for all of us in the county to read. Over the years, these books have taken us to some thought-provoking places. We've been to pre-Castro Cuba, a World War II Japanese-American internment camp, the civil rights movement in the South during the 60s, and an island in the Pacific. These are just a few of the time periods and places we've explored courtesy of one book. Reading tends to be a solitary activity, but one book is designed to encourage us all to come together as a community to learn and be inspired by reading and discussing the same book. What could be better? Great books reveal the grit and spunk of their main characters, both fictional and real, and tonight's book is no exception. In a few minutes, you will all hear this year's One Book, One San Diego author, Judith Heumann, discuss her book, Being Human, an unrepentant memoir of a disability rights activist, and her lifelong effort to achieve respect, acceptance, and inclusion. First, it's important for us to recognize our sponsors who make One Book, One San Diego possible. I'd like to thank the Lyndon Root Dickinson Foundation, Lloyd Pest Control, the Dr. Seuss Fund at the San Diego Foundation, Kaiser Permanente, and the Seth Sprague Educational and Charitable Foundation, the Payne Family Foundation, and the City of San Diego. Your support makes this program free and open to every member of our community. I'd also like to thank the One Book Advisory Committee. The group is made up of 25 librarians, teachers, and book lovers from One Book partner organizations. Thank you everyone on the committee for sharing your time and knowledge with this program and for choosing such an inspiring book for our community. They had more than 150 book submissions from all of you out there. So thank you. Now I'd like to introduce a local celebrity of sorts, Alex Montoya, who will discuss how Judy's work has impacted him personally. Alex is the owner of A Motivational Communications and an account executive at Mixty Communications. He is also an accomplished author. He has written 6 books, most recently a children's book about inclusion. He was one of the first San Diegans mainstreamed from special education in 1980, a feat that earned him a spot in the San Diego Unified School District's Hall of Fame in 2013. And in 2014, Alex was also selected to be a KPBS local hero for Disability Awareness Month. He is the former manager of Latino Affairs for the San Diego Padres, where he oversaw the team's outreach and charitable programs to the Latino community in San Diego and Mexico. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you. Good evening. I have been so blessed as a writer and a speaker to share stages with people such as Oscar, causing me to be born missing both of my arms and my right leg. In 1978, I immigrated to the United States and was shocked to see that people with disabilities at that time were not allowed to be in regular education or regular curriculum schools like the rest of our peers. I'll never forget how shortly after receiving the first prosthetics that I was going to wear for the rest of my life, when a group of friends invited me to join them in an activity that I didn't know was possible because of the fact that I was in a school specifically with other kids with disabilities, and all of my friends who were able bodied and non disabled, who I would play with every day after school, but were all of a sudden were told that I couldn't go to school with them and could not interact with them. We're in a whole different campus right across the way divided by a fence. One day, I think we snuck over during recess, and my friends were so happy to see me. They said, "Hey, Alex, come over to the playground. Come play with us." And I said, "Well, I don't really know how much I can do. I just got these new prosthetics, artificial arms, and a prosthetic leg, and I don't want to get in trouble or get hurt. I just don't know how much I can do." And they said, "Well, don't worry about that. We're going to have a good time no matter what." And they invited me onto this beautiful, shiny, metallic object called the monkey bars. For me, even in my short time in the United States, I knew the monkey bars were everything. I knew this was something that I had to try, but I didn't know if I could do it necessarily. I was probably 6 years old at the time, but already this was a major, major dream to be able to do it. And I'll never forget, there were about 10 friends there, and 5 of them said, "You know what? You're probably right. It's a little risky. You really shouldn't be on this side of the fence anyway. Our teachers have told us that we belong here and you belong there, and we need to be separate during the school day. So it's probably not a good idea. And if you fall down or get hurt or worse, then we're going to all be in trouble." And I said, "Yeah, you're probably right." But then I had the other 5 friends who said, "No, no, no, no. Don't worry about that. You're over here. We're going to have a good time. We're going to figure out how to get you on the monkey bars." So what they did was they actually helped me take my 2 prosthetic arms, which have hooks on them. They did when I was a kid and they do now. And they said, "Let's figure out a way to get you onto the monkey bars. What if," and I think that's the 2 greatest words in the English language because it speaks to possibility and it speaks to the realm of wonderment. They said, "What if we take your hooks and clasp them onto the ladders of the monkey bars and we just climb one rung at a time and climb and climb and climb? And what if we take your left leg, which was my good leg, and put all your weight on it and just kind of drag your right leg, which is the leg that has my prosthetic, and just kind of drag you up and pull you up and pull you up?" And all of a sudden, I realized that what we envisioned, I was doing. I was climbing onto the ladder, one rung at a time, taking my good leg, putting all the weight on it, and using my right leg and just kind of dragging it up. And at this time, all 10 friends, the ones that said that I could do it, the ones that said that I couldn't do it, they're yelling, they're cheering, they're whistling. Girls are inviting me to prom. It was just crazy. It was just bananas all the way through. And I get all the way to the top of the monkey bars, and they realized we had thought so much about what it was going to take to get on top of the monkey bars that we didn't think about what it was going to take to get across the monkey bars. And my friends all of a sudden were very worried and very anguished, and all of the same fears came back to them. And I said, "Don't worry, I have a strap harness on the back of my prosthetic arms, and if you raise them up just a little bit, it'll raise my arms even higher, and I can start moving across and across and across the monkey bars." All of a sudden, we heard the worst sound that you'd want to hear at that moment, which was "eh." That was the school bell. And here I am on a campus I'm not supposed to be on as a troublemaker. And all of a sudden, my friends had to all scatter and disperse to the classes they came to. Finally, a teacher came out and helped me down, and she said, "Alejandro Montoya Gonzalez." And I knew I was in trouble when she said all 3 names. She said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Hey, I'm just hanging out. How about you?" And she laughed and she helped me down. But it taught me 3 key things, and I'll finish with this. It taught me 3 key things that impacted the entirety of my life and impacts me today. By joining my friends on those monkey bars, it taught me number 1, that we will never have a level of satisfaction or equality in this society without risk. There must be some risk to what we do. Number 2, that what they were really trying to help me do was not just have fun, but to also have empowerment, to be empowered to have access to their slice of life and their slice of society. And finally, number 3, all of the friends that helped me realize for the first time in my life the meaning of inclusion. The meaning of inclusion and realizing how important it is to society. Those lessons that I learned that day led me to become the first in my family to go to college and graduate from college, led me to become a writer and a speaker and a media relations executive and an activist and all the things that I've ever wanted to be. all because I was included on that one day. So we must continue to fight and take risks and make sure we grant others access, but most importantly, to have inclusion for all. Thank you for having me.
Personal story on how, we all could benefit from more inclusion and taking those risks. So I do now want to introduce the disability rights activist, Judith Heumann herself. Judy contracted polio in 1949 in Brooklyn, New York, and began to use a wheelchair for her mobility. She was denied the right to attend school because she was considered a fire hazard at the age of 5. Her parents played a strong role in fighting for her rights as a child, but Judy soon determined that she, working in collaboration with other disabled people, had to be their own advocates. She is now an internationally recognized leader in the disability rights community. Judy graduated from Long Island University in Brooklyn in 1969 and received her master's in public health from the University of California at Berkeley in 1975. She has been instrumental in the development and implementation of legislation such as Section 504, the Individuals with Education Act, and the Americans with Disabilities Act, just to name a few. Judy is a founding member of the Berkeley Center for Independent Living, which is the first grassroots center of its kind in the United States, and helped to launch the independent living movement both nationally and globally. In 1983, Judy co-founded the World Institute on Disability, one of the first global disability rights organizations founded and continually led by people with disabilities. She served as the Assistant Secretary for the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services in the Department of Education during the Clinton administration, and then served as the World Bank's first advisor on disability and development from 2002 to 2006. She was appointed as the first special advisor for international disability rights at the U.S. Department of State from 2010 to 2017. Judy authored her book, Being Human with Kristen Joyner, and has been featured in numerous documentaries, including Crip Camp, A Disability Revolution, a 2020 award-winning documentary film on Netflix. And she also produces a podcast called The Human Perspective. Judy will be interviewed by our arts calendar editor and producer, Julia Dixon Evans. Julia writes the KPBS Arts newsletter, produces and edits the KPBS Arts calendar, and works with our news team to cover San Diego's diverse arts scene. She is also a published author herself and a short fiction writer. She is the founder of Last Exit, a local reading series and literary journal, and she won the 2019 National Magazine Award for Fiction. We are happy to take questions for Judy, so please feel free to ask your questions in the chat box. And now it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Judy Heumann and Julia Dixon Evans.
Hi there. Hi, Judy.
Hi, Julia. Nice to see you.
You too. It is such an honor to have you here, and I am really excited to share this book with all of San Diego. And I know that you hesitated to even write the book because this is the story of many. So can we start there about the process and about the decision to finally go through with telling the story?
Sure. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for selecting our book. It's really an honor, and I look forward to our discussion tonight. So the process was, I had polio in 1949, and so over the course of my life, as you heard when my resume was being discussed, I'm 73 years old. So I've had many jobs, and of course, our life is more than our work. And so much work going on also in the community. And I'm a storyteller. I love telling stories. And over the years, as I was giving public presentations, people would say to me, "You need to write a book." And I would say, "I'm not a writer, and I don't have any time." And then in around 2000, late 16, 17, I was approached by a company that was interested in talking with me about getting an agent and then getting someone who could write with me, and that came through. And so in 2017, I signed up with a company that was able to find me Kristen Joyner. And Kristen and I did not know each other. I lived in DC at that time. She lived in Berkeley. She really knew very little about the disability rights community, although she'd lived in Berkeley for many years. And when we met, I decided that it would be an interesting road ahead because she was a good writer and we seemed to click. And so for the next couple of years, through many changes, because she moved from Berkeley eventually to New Zealand. So a lot of the work that we were doing was being done between the United States and New Zealand. But what I think was very important about the work that we were doing is that we were each learning. So she was learning about disability, and I was really also learning about how writers write. And I was also learning about how I needed to make sure that my voice and my stories were represented the way I wanted them to be. And I needed to learn how to be able to be candid with Kristen if there were issues that I had concerns about. And likewise, for her to be able to do the same thing for me when I didn't understand her writing process and how, she had this certain way that she got into her head and went off and wrote. And it was really fun in many ways. So I'm hoping that what we've been able to present in this book, of course, is not the full detail of my life, but many significant aspects of my life that I hope enable a broad audience of disabled and non-disabled people to learn about the issues that I and so many other people face on a daily basis and what we've been doing over the last number of decades to really help make changes within the United States and around the world.
So now, today in 2021, the non-disabled world really takes for granted the presence of things like ramps and interpreters even, but of course they're still not everywhere. But let's first talk about the way things were, the world in the 1950s for you, before all of this work. What was the reality for you and others in your community when you were a child?
I always think it's important for us to look beyond accessibility. Obviously, accessibility is very important for anyone with a physical disability or who's blind or deaf or whatever disability one may have, accommodations that one may need. They are critical because our inability to be able to become a part of the community in a natural way like other people continues to allow people to think of us as less than human, less than who they are as individual people. And I think ultimately what we're talking about is enabling disabled individuals, regardless of the type of disability, regardless of when they acquired their disability. And I think this is really an important point because people acquire their disabilities more as they get older. A relatively small percentage of people are actually born with their disabilities or have their disabilities before the age of 16 or 15. You see the numbers of people going up increasingly as people get older. And so that's a very important issue that if you don't have a disability one day and acquire a disability the next day, and you've never seen disabled people actively involved in the community, whether they have a visible or invisible disability, then you may also have been someone who was afraid of disabled people, didn't know how to reach out and speak to somebody, and didn't know how and what kinds of accommodations one may need. So yes, a bathroom that's accessible. Yes, a ramp that's accessible. But you also want to be working with people and socializing with people who see you as they see themselves and others, who are not reluctant or afraid or avoid people who have depression or anxiety or lupus or cancer or spinal cord injury or Parkinson's or MS or learning disabilities or whatever the disability may be. And there's so many. We want people to, and I wanted this book to enable people to see that we, I, in my personal life, needed to fight for changes to enable me to really be able to contribute and to be able to do that in a way that other people take for granted. And I think it's also an opportunity to share with people how many of us feel that it's so important not just to be working on removing barriers by ourselves, but actually to be able to be working collaboratively with people you know and don't know, and really to get people engaged in the changes that we're needing to make, understanding why they need to be made.
Thank you. As you know, Alex, who we heard from earlier, was one of the first students in San Diego Unified to be part of the mainstream system of special education in 1980. And a big part of your story is the Health Conservation 21 public school. Can you tell us a little bit, some of the things you discovered in that experience?
Yeah, so as Alex was mentioning, he was in a special class or a special school for kids with disabilities. And I think this was in the 1950s. And this was, I guess it was in California, but I'm not sure where. But at any rate, in New York, if you had a physical disability and were unable to walk up and down stairs independently, then they put you in special classes. And the classes that I went to were called Health Conservation 21. As we got older, it was like, what were they trying to conserve our health for? It made no sense. And why 21? And it was all this kind of mumbo jumbo language, which I think separates people and makes people afraid. Why is someone going to want to engage with someone who's in an HC 21 class or a Health Conservation 21 class? I frequently speak about these labels and how they reinforce people's negative views about who we are. And I think additionally, one of the critical problems with the programs that I was in, and I presume Alex too, is that there was not the same expectation from educators that we were going to be learning what other children were learning. So for me, I was on something called home instruction for the first, second, third, and half of fourth grade, which meant that I had a teacher who came to my house 2.5 hours a week, not 2.5 hours a day, 2.5 hours a week. That in and of itself was clearly saying that my brothers went to school for 6 to 6.5 hours a day, and I was basically in 1 week getting less than the equivalent to a one-day education that my brothers and cousins and friends were receiving. Now, did I understand that when I was 6 years old or 7 years old or 8 years old? No, but as I was getting older, and clearly my parents recognized that, that was one of the important beginning issues for me. That, as education is something that is considered so important, why was education for disabled kids considered so unimportant? And, we spent our day at that time, and much has changed, but I want to say that unfortunately, not all has changed the way it needs to. And so I would spend, like my friends and colleagues, an hour and a half each way to go to school because my neighborhood school wouldn't accept me. And so I was spending like 2 to 3 hours a day on a bus. And then when I got to school, we had pull out for the therapies. Not that they weren't important, but they shouldn't have been a part of the school day. So, and then we had a lunch hour for an hour and a mandatory rest period. So we got to school about 8:30. We started, quote unquote, learning around 9. We had lunch, rest period from 11 to 1. And while all the other kids left school at 3, we were packing up at 2. So really, the most we could have gotten out of a day was 3 hours a day. Now, for me, one of the most important parts about going to these classes and going to summer camps with disabled children was that I was finally able to meet other people who looked like me. And as we were getting older, we were also being able to formulate what we saw as the problem. And I want to really shout out to my parents and many other parents with disabled kids then and now. They were my advocates. They taught me advocacy, even though they were not advocates before I had polio. And so I think, and this is not just a disability issue, for families who are marginalized in communities where education and other opportunities are not equal, families really need to recognize that supporting their children not only benefits their individual child, but can benefit many other children, but also instills within the child, in my case, me and my brothers, that we should not accept no, that we needed to be the ones that were really fighting for change. I think all of that, was very important, and being able to think about those issues and how to express them in the book in a way that would engage people and not repel people, I think, was very important. Coming along for the ride, so to speak.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the Section 504 sit-in in 1977. And it wasn't the first time you advocated for yourself or did some advocacy work, though it is such a notable experience. Can you talk a little bit about what that was like for you, that community, and the way you found kind of like an intersectionality in that community before we even had a word for intersectionality?
Yeah, we used other words. We were doing it, but we didn't use the word intersection. I used the words collaboration, cooperation. Yeah, anyway. So I was living in Brooklyn when President Nixon vetoed a piece of legislation called the Rehabilitation Act of 1972. I was one of the founders and chairperson of an organization called Disabled in Action. And we were a cross-disability rights-based group that had basically no money. We were all volunteers. Many of us were working also. And we were young, inexperienced, but driven. We had a desire to uncover and protest and try to reform areas where we felt discrimination was pretty rampant. And so this organization, DIA, was working on everything from improving education to closing down sheltered workshops to protesting against the Jerry Lewis telethon for muscular dystrophy because of its portrayal of disabled people. And one day we learned that this piece of legislation, the Rehabilitation Act of 1972, had a provision in there called Section 504. Remember, this is the early 70s and the mid 60s when the Civil Rights Act was passed. Disability was not a part of that law. And it really wasn't until 1990 that the disability community in the U.S. had equivalent legislation to the Civil Rights Act. But we protested the vetoing of this law in part because of this provision, Section 504, which we felt was going to be very important. It prohibited discrimination against disabled people if the entity received money from the federal government. And while it didn't cover the private sector, and that didn't come about at the federal level till 1990, what it did say was, in 42 words, the law needed to be changed because it needed to be strengthened, and we needed to get regulations, rules to implement Section 504. And finally, in 1973, Nixon signed that law. And then over the next number of years, there were discussions all around the United States. The Department of Health, Education, and Welfare was meeting with the disability community and universities and hospitals and any entity that was getting money from the federal government in order to understand what we saw as discrimination, what we saw as remedies, and what others saw as discrimination and what they saw as remedies. And it took quite a number of years to come up with a set of regulations that would really, in our view, protect the rights of disabled people. And this process, as I was saying, dragged on for a number of years. President Ford refused to sign the then proposed regulations. He said they were too much and it wasn't possible to do. And when President Carter was running for office, he had committed to getting these regulations signed. And that's what the community wanted across the United States. We wanted the regulations signed as they were, because over the years of development, when you brought together disabled people and those who received money from the federal government, their objective was to do as little as possible. Our objective was to do as much as possible. And like anything, we had to really come to a set of agreements that made nobody completely happy. And then the Secretary of HEW was not signing the regulations. And so there was a group that had been formed called the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities. Right in the beginning of 1977, we had a meeting, and it was decided that we were very concerned about the fact that the Secretary not only had not yet signed the regulations, but that he had come from working with universities and hospitals as a lobbyist, and we were very concerned that in his position of authority, that they would be going to make significant changes. So that's why the American Coalition of Citizens with Disabilities decided that we would pass a motion at our board meeting stating that if the regulations weren't released and signed by a certain day, that we were going to have demonstrations around the country. And they weren't signed, and that's what happened. Now, the demonstrations in San Francisco Bay Area were the longest, and still today is the longest demonstration that ever has been held in a federal building. And I think what's important about those demonstrations is there were about 150 people who had various disabilities, various ages. There was a mother and her son who was about 4 years old who stayed for a number of days, newly disabled individuals, and people who had their disabilities from birth, war veterans, Vietnam War veterans who had themselves been injured or other people were injured, religious organizations, the Black Panthers, if you've seen Crip Camp. But I think ultimately the regulations were signed as they were prior to the demonstrations. And so why I think these particular activities get so much note is because we really did, as a community, bond together. And I think we used it also as an opportunity, particularly in the Bay Area, but nationally, because there was national attention. Machinists Union, for example, came with us. About 25 of us went from San Francisco to DC and worked with people in DC. And we were covered by ABC, and many other outlets. And so it was resilience. And I think when the regulations were signed and the disabled people in San Francisco left the building, you could literally hear what they were saying and see their emotions, that people felt that we, in our own way, were able to get people to begin to understand why this piece of legislation was important, what it meant for disabled children not to be in regular schools or integrated for no other reason than they had a disability, for no other reason that people didn't feel it was as important to educate us as non-disabled children, and likewise in employment in other areas.
Thank you. One of my favorite parts in the book is when you turn to a friend and you say you did this regularly, where you would, after speaking out, you would turn to a friend and say, "How'd I do?" But there's also a moment where you're alone. You don't have your support around you, and that's when you're on the plane. There's a situation where you write about where your human rights are violated on the plane, and you fight back. But it's sort of like in between actually getting on board and before another confrontation. You mentioned that you have, after everything you do, this series of doubts that go through your mind. Can you talk about like one thing that you also do to overcome that? Like, how did you get past that to continue fighting, to fight for the next thing?
I don't really have an answer, except I just do, because, again, sometimes I've been noticing, as I'm involved in doing different things and having to look at like pictures historically, I get this certain physical persona when I'm like going on the attack. And, it's like when I'm speaking more seriously and kind of having an out of body experience is the way I describe it sometimes, where I'm kind of leaning forward and you can see that my chin is going out. And you can see this in many different pictures over many years. I think it's finally where something is happening, which doesn't mean I'm not really scared, but where I really believe that I can't just, it's a challenge and I may not win, but I'm not going to let anybody, be a pushover. I don't do it equally. I mean, I'm dealing with something in our neighborhood that's been going on for a while. A new gym that was built, that they took facility that was accessible and made it inaccessible, and everything going on with COVID. I haven't yet gotten the situation resolved, but the airline situation was kind of a quick little story. I was working for a U.S. Senator. His name was Harrison Williams. And I had come home for vacation, and there were a set of proposed regulations that were being put forward by the FAA, I believe it was, about disabled people being able to travel by ourselves. Now, a little note, I was terrified of flying. Over the years, I would take a Valium before I flew. I would have a little flask and I would drink, and I don't drink a lot. And I would drink. My father gave me some, scotch, and I would sleep on the plane. But it was a short flight between New York and going back to DC. And I also had the book Fear of Flying on my lap. When I went with my parents to get, to board the plane, at first they weren't going to issue me my ticket because I was flying by myself. And that was the issue. Can someone with a disability fly by themselves? And so I knew that that was not a rule, because I was sitting on the book and reading the regulation that was debating whether or not that was something they could put forward. And of course, my boss was not going to support that. So I asked to speak to another manager. And as I recall, it took me two people before I got to one who said, because I'm sitting there going, I work for Senator Williams. This is the material. You cannot do what you're saying. And so they allowed me to get on the plane. There I was, flying by myself, looking at fear of flying and the regulations, proposed regulations, and a flight attendant comes back and says, I can't fly unattended. And I'm like, oh my God, what is going on? I just dealt with this at the ticket counter. And I said, basically, no, I'm not getting off the plane. The pilot came back. He kneels down next to me. He takes out, I said, let me see the rule. So the pilot comes back and he says, look, this says I have complete control over the plane. And if I want you off the plane, unless you do what I say, you have no right. And so they came back and they asked this gentleman next to me, would he be willing to assist me in the event of an emergency? And he said yes. And I said, thank you, but no, because in the event of an emergency, just because they look like I may need help, there are going to be many other people on the plane that are going to need help. And why am I the only one being singled out for this? This went back and forth. And finally, this is in New York, and there's something called Port Authority Police. And they are New Jersey, New York police for the airports. And so these two big guys come on the airplane and they tell me that I'm being put under arrest. Well, partly I was really excited. I'm like, oh my God, how could this be happening? I'm so excited. I hadn't planned it at all. And I thought, okay, they're going to arrest me. We're going to be able to do a press conference about why they did and why it was wrong. So, but I didn't ask them what the charges were. They took me off the plane and they asked me for ID. Well, I didn't drive and I didn't have regular ID. They asked me for ID and I gave them my American Express card. And then they asked me for more ID and I gave them my Senate ID card. And of course, then they said, who did I work for? And I said, Senator Williams. Well, then everything changed because they did know who he was. So then the last plane of the day left. I was at the airport myself. They didn't press charges. And to say this whole story is because a lot of this is like pushing as much as I can and other people do to try to turn this around. And in the end, we did sue the airlines. And in the end, they did come to a settlement. And the regulation did not come out the way they were hoping it did. But these types of stories continued.
Thank you. I do have one last quick question, and then we're going to turn to audience questions, which we have some great questions coming in. With the pandemic, I think we're at a point in American history where accessibility is maybe more at the front of people's minds than possibly ever before for the non-disabled world. Virtual things like this exact event or the work from home revolution. Would you say that these are like certain victories, or is that really oversimplifying things?
I mean, I would say in states like California, accessibility, both because of federal and state laws, is certainly much better than it was in the 1970s. New buildings are being built accessible. When buildings are being modified, they're accessible. Roads and hospitals and all of that is being done much better, and it's a much stronger focus on accessibility for technology and things like this, which I think is important. So I want to say that continuing to make sure that existing technologies and new technologies as they're evolving are being planned to be accessible from the beginning. And we can look at areas like captioning and see that has not yet happened as it needs to be, because captioning is not anywhere near as accurate as it needs to be. It is getting better. When you go to Google Teams or to Zoom or whatever it may be, if they have captioning functions and if you understand how to use them, you'll see that the accuracy is getting better, but it's still not 100%. But I want people to move beyond accessibility. I want people really to be looking at where are people within their homes, their communities, their places they socialize, um, everyday life, on television, in theaters, where and how are disabled people being depicted? If you're buying children's books, people are looking more and more for books that are diverse, that are racially diverse, that represent girls in non-stereotypical ways. But representation of disabled children with and without visible disabilities is so hard to find. So children continue not to see themselves. They see themselves once in a while on Sesame Street or other really good programs, but there is not a consistent drumbeat of people who may talk about having emotional disabilities like depression or anxiety or bipolar, which in my mind is so important now because of the pandemic and how many people are facing short-term, if not long-term, mental health issues because of isolation and fear, on, and how we need to be able to talk about, our disabilities, not in a way which makes people feel afraid, but in a normal way of talking. So for me, we're not going to be able to make the substantial changes that we need to make that are involved with Black Lives Matter and the Latinx community and the indigenous peoples movements and the LGBTQIA movements, on, if we are not really meaningfully looking at how have we been raised? What do we think? What are we doing? What changes are we making? What are we looking at in our schools with the disproportionate differences, living in a poor neighborhood versus a wealthy neighborhood, having money and being able to fight for things versus not. I mean, it just goes on and on. We, many of us really want to see diversity as we fight for it in our communities, truly inclusive of disabled people who come from all these different backgrounds. And we are intergenerational because the older you become, the more likely it is you'll acquire a temporary or permanent disability.
Thank you. Let's move on to some audience questions now. This one came in without a name, but what is the most helpful thing that allies can do to help the cause of disability rights right now?
Speak to disabled people, get involved with disability rights organizations, speak to friends and family, learn about what discrimination is, learn about changes that are being made, learn about how people are feeling, because so frequently when one acquires a disability, the circle around them changes. People don't know how to speak to people. They don't know the words to use. If you're a manager in a business, what are you doing to recruit disabled people? Are you listening to disabled employees? Are you making sure that your human resource offices are fully knowledgeable about what they should be doing to recruit and to train HR staff and hiring managers and on and on? And then I think on a fundamental level, look at what you're consuming. Are you consuming, when looking at films, television programs, documentaries, how is disability being depicted? Are disabled characters being played by disabled people? If you ask your friends with disabilities what they think about the representation in the film, what are they saying? And as I said earlier tonight when I was meeting with some of the supporters of this program, representation is critically important. If we don't see ourselves depicted in a way which is not demonizing, because disability frequently has been demonized, something for people to be afraid of, or where people are always thinking about not being disabled, or older movies or things where, remember the soap operas where typically if someone had a disability, somewhere along the line they were cured. We're not looking for cures. It doesn't mean that we don't want science and research to go forward to deal with certain disabilities. But it does mean that we want you to accept us as who we are. We want you to bring us to the table. We want you to genuinely bring us to the table, and we want you to listen to what we're saying. And most importantly, we also want to be at these leadership tables. And we want to, as one of the people who just wrote a note, normalize disability. I think that's so accurate. We are a normal, natural part of the community, and we shouldn't be afraid of using the word disability. Let me just say one thing for those of you from San Diego, but in California. The Oscars and the Tonys and the Emmys and the whatever awards. Last Sunday we had the Emmys, and the Emmys were yet again, the stage where you accepted your award was completely inaccessible. Now, it is the law that these things be accessible, but nonetheless, I'm tired of having to feel that what we have to do is to threaten the CBS. Why in the world could they not be making a stage, whether or not they knew somebody would need it or not, where a ramp was integrated into the stairs? Whoever said that steps are so beautiful that we want to preclude people from joining unless we know in advance that someone is going to need it? And that's what one of the people said. Well, we looked and we don't have anybody that we know who's using a wheelchair who's going to need to get on stage. And therefore, what? That means it's not going to be accessible? You're not going to put bathrooms into buildings because maybe people don't need to go to the bathroom? I mean, it's so crazy. And these are some of the things that I think the average person, write to CBS. Why were the Emmys not accessible? This year, the Academies were accessible, but only because of a huge amount of fighting. And this Sunday, I think the Grammys are coming up, and I doubt they're going to be accessible either. And so, it is this ongoing drumbeat where something like this should not be acceptable. And as a society, as communities, we really need to let people know whether or not there is someone that who's going to need to get on the stage. It is what we need to do. It is what we need to be telling our communities. Everything needs to be accessible.
Thank you. Okay, Emily Bassett Mason on Facebook asks, what may be good resources for parents in terms of helping prepare their 10-year-old autistic daughter for working and living independently in the future?
I'd say there are lots of things. One is there's an organization called, at the national level, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. And I don't know if you know about them, but if you don't, you should go online and look them up. They're an organization led by people who have autism. I would look at meeting, if you're a parent, other parents who have disabled kids who maybe are now adults and who have, been able to support their children, and who are now, in some cases, finishing high school, going to college, getting jobs. And I know people of autism have various, degrees of significance of disability, but disabled people with autism can grow up to do many wonderful things. But letting them meet other people with autism, and again, it's just like exposing people. And I think it's also really important to make sure that the schools are doing what they need to do with the children, and that they're not looking at segregating kids, and that we are looking at what we need to do to help support children's learning, and to be able to help ensure that they're being given equal opportunities and positive messages about who they are and what they can do. and look really up and out to other people who are on the same journey and can be supportive.
One more question, and it is a huge question for 3 minutes, but we'll do it. Raul Rodriguez Gonzalez on YouTube asked, Judy, as a disabled woman, did you find an added gender challenge adjusting to life?
Certainly. As I said, I was born in 1947. And so, amongst everything else, I am a woman. And so I was not only dealing with discrimination based on disability, but based on my gender and also expectations. I mean, my parents were, I think in some way unique, in as much as my mother said to me when I was like a young kid, you don't know if you're going to be able to get married because you have a disability. So that message was out there. You may not be marriage material because you have a disability. She didn't say it that way, and I don't think she meant it that way. But she clearly was saying, you cannot depend on getting married and having your husband support you. So you need to be able to study, think about going to college and getting a job that can support you. Now, that was very important for me. My father supported that. I have 2 younger brothers. And my mother, while she didn't work full time, did work full time, both being a mother and working half time with my dad and then supporting us. So definitely being a woman at that period meant also being discriminated against because I had a disability. I was a woman. And disabled men absolutely discriminated against disabled women, as did the broader society. So it's getting better, like issues for women are also. But the women's movement itself, in my view, has not really actively embraced and recruited disabled women with different disabilities, different racial, sexual orientations, blah, blah, blah. And so that's what we're really needing to see is the diversity in the area of women really becoming something which is understood, where disabled women are coming into these organizations and moving up in the ranks of leadership and acknowledging that they have a disability. I think that's a big issue. And you're seeing it a little bit in Hollywood and other places of note, where people who are people of note are coming out saying that they have a mental health disability, or they have MS, or they have whatever. And I think that's very important.
Okay, do you have time for one more? There's one more.
Sure.
This one came in, it's anonymous, but they said, I loved how your passion came through in the book. Do you still have that fire in your belly? Or do you find that your feelings have mellowed a little over time?
I don't know that my feelings have mellowed. I hope in the way I've talked tonight, it doesn't look like my feelings have mellowed. I think, COVID, I mean, my jobs have changed also. So, my first like 23, 25 years, I was working on a day-to-day basis in disability rights organizations. Then when I moved to working in government domestically and UN, like the World Bank and others, I would say that the fire in my belly did not at all get distinguished, but I had to learn, because I chose to work in these jobs ultimately, even though they were offered to me, I could have said no. I chose to want to figure out a way that I could get these big institutions to look at disability and what their responsibility was. So, for example, in the State Department under the Obama administration, it was a wonderful job. I got to travel a lot and also work with really great foreign service workers and civil service workers in the State Department. But most of them knew nothing about disability, did not think about disability as a human rights issue. And so much of, coming in and yelling at people, which I never did actually, but I really had to, with my staff and others who got it, really look at not only how do we need to allow people to understand why this is important, but I think in the area of disability and other areas, people need to know what they have to do, how they can do it. People with the best of intentions may do it the wrong way, and it's not that there is only one way to do things, but if there aren't disabled people working with them, if disabled people are not involved in crafting what needs to happen, for example, the State Department every year writes human rights reports. If the people at the country level who work for the State Department are going out and gathering information, if they don't understand that they need to talk to disability rights groups to learn about what the violations are, and not just the government who's not going to tell them, then the report is not going to come out seriously. Or if they're not talking to disabled people who are living these experiences every day, then the reports that they're going to put forth are not going to be as legitimate as if they did. So it's really helping people step by step learn so that they on their own also can figure out what to do, and really to ensure that as new hiring is going on, disabled people are being hired, and people who have experience in many different ways. I think that's, as women have moved up the food chain in business, the Me Too movement, on and on, we are seeing changes. Those changes would not have come about if women were not demanding and weren't able to move up the food chain. And we still do not see enough women with visible and invisible disabilities moving up this food chain. Nothing about us, nothing about it without, nothing about us without us. And many people now are saying nothing without us and cutting it down just to nothing without us. So.
All right. We have almost 20 more great questions that we can't get to, but we definitely appreciate all the questions and the interaction. Judy, thank you so much. Thank you for writing this book, and also thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you to the audience for tuning in. You can visit kpbs.org/one-book to learn about, oh, there it is. I don't have to read it. You can learn about all of our 2021 One Book, One San Diego events. And finally, I hope you all have a great evening, and thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
And I'm going to bed. Good night. Thank you. It was fun.
All right.